Hello, everybody. I am Blake Cabot. I am the owner of careerlearning.com, and we have the great honor of having the all too fabulous John Rubino. John has been doing HR for 35 years. He's had his own consulting practice for 28. He is a SHRM, SCP, CCP, CBP, GRP, and a WLCP. And I don't know what most of those mean, but he is obviously a strong achiever. So he's a great speaker. We've had him many times, and I'm thrilled to have him talking today about KPIs. And so with that said, a couple of housekeeping things. One, John's coming up with a link. We're having a class next week on cash compensation programs. So please join us for that. And we have all the resources on Zoom. So if you go to the resources button down below, you can see all the slides are available. Also a link to his upcoming class. And also please ask any questions you want in the Q&A or chat, and I will relay those to John. So with that said, John, take it away.
Hey, thanks a lot, Blake. Always a pleasure working with you and Career Learning. Welcome, everyone, for joining us for this very short session on compensation KPIs, really compensation metrics. Now, again, as Blake said, next week, we're going to be doing our big certification program on cash compensation programs, where we develop pay programs from scratch. So I look forward to seeing many of you there. We also have another certification on compensation metrics, where we do a deep dive into the subject matter that we're discussing today. Of course, our time is short, so I'm just going to kind of give you the highlights of the most important metrics that we need to know in developing and analyzing our compensation programs. We always start off with compensation objectives. I'm not going to read all of these to you, but these are what I consider generic objectives. My recommendation is to know these and to align them more specifically to your own organization. I do want to emphasize the two most important objectives, and these are the first two. We want our compensation programs to be both internally equitable and externally competitive. And we have specific methodologies to address those two most important objectives. And we're going to be talking a lot about that next week in our certification program. I'll start off relatively simple and then get a little more challenging with the metrics. And I'm going to give you some practical examples on how to use these metrics in your practice. Probably the most important one is the individual comp ratio. It's very simple formula. This is where we take the salary and divide it by the midpoint of the grade that that particular job is in. Now, of course, you already have to have your traditional compensation structure in place in order to do the comp ratio analysis. What this does is give you a ratio relationship of where the employee salaries are relative to the midpoint of the grade that they're in. This is a very practical metric to analyze the distribution of your employee salaries among your salary structure and gives you a strong indication of whether you're administering your salaries in the most structured way throughout the course of the year. And again, very simple. Let's say we have an employee with a salary of $36,000. The midpoint of the grade is $40,000. Individual comp ratio, divide the 36 into the 40, and that gives you that ratio relationship. Now, of course, if the salary is below the midpoint, we're going to get a comp ratio less than 1. If the salary salary is above the midpoint, it's going to be a comp ratio more than one. I do this for my clients all around the world. We want to make sure that our managers are administering their salaries in the most structured way possible to realize those two important objectives of being both internally equitable and externally competitive. Another ratio relationship that's also important is the department comp ratio. Now, I have seen this done incorrectly many times in the real world. So we want to make sure that we do this the right way. And I'll give you a very simple example. Let's say we have this very scary department of Freddie and Carrie. You see their base salaries, you see their midpoints. I computed the individual comp ratio for both of them. But here's the important point: only one correct way of doing a department comp ratio. We need to treat the department as if it were one entity. So we need to add up all the base salaries in the department, then add up all the midpoints, and take the ratio relationship of those two bottom line numbers. It is not correct to take the average of the individual comp ratios. And I see that done in the real world many times. Then, of course, faulty business decisions are made from that analysis going forward. So we want to make sure we do it correct. And you see in this example here, we add up the base salaries, we get 146,000. We add up the midpoints, we get 140,000. So the department comp ratio is 104.3%. Here's a practical example, and many of my clients do this. They use the department ratio to determine the distribution of salary monies in each department within the company. So, for instance, if the human resources department has a comp ratio of 0.80 and finance has a comp ratio of 1.10, human resources is going to get proportionally more money. And the thinking is over time, we want to aggregate all of our employees' salaries around their respective midpoints as best we can. Now, it'll never be perfect because, as you know, there's many reasons why we pay employees what we pay them. But the important point is to structuralize how we distribute our salary money so we can make sure that the increases we give in base pay to all of our employees are both internally equitable and externally competitive. A related concept to comp ratio is range penetration. Range penetration simply gives you a percent of how much you penetrate within your particular salary range. Now, as you know, salary ranges in a structured way have midpoints, they have minimums, and they have maximums. The midpoint is considered the competitive rate. This is why we structure many of our metrics around that midpoint. The minimum, of course, is the least amount you want to pay an employee in that grade, and the maximum is the most that you want to pay. So, another metric to use to analyze our salary distributions is range penetration. So if you penetrate 0% in your range, of course, you're paid at the minimum. You penetrate 100%, you're paid at the maximum. And you penetrate 50%, you're paid at the midpoint. The definition of the midpoint, it is the exact monetary middle between the minimum and the maximum. If you have a midpoint, something you call a midpoint, that is not the exact monetary middle, then in fact it is not a midpoint. Now, what about all of those other salaries? Well, we have a very simple formula to determine range penetration for all of our employees. You take the pay rate, subtract the minimum over the maximum minus the minimum, and that gives you the range penetration percent. Now, I like to communicate range penetration to my employees because it is a more intuitive concept than the comp ratio. Comp ratio is our jargon that we use in compensation. Employees understand better what range penetration is. So when I do this analysis for my clients, I do it both ways. I do a comp ratio analysis, both individual and departmental, and I also do the range penetration. But when I communicate this to the workforce, I like to communicate range penetration. Another important concept, and this relates directly to how we analyze market data. Whenever you submit your salary information to a vendor, and of course, they have to compile it, they have to analyze it, they have to compute a final report. When you receive that final report, the salary information is already old because typically it takes these vendors maybe 3 or 4 months to complete the process. Every salary survey has a salary effective date. That is the date that you actually submit your salary information. Now, when you get it 3 or 4 months later, the salary information is already old. So, what we need to do is age our salary survey information to a common date. In this way, we can be assured that we're always dealing with up to date market data. So, this is the process we need to follow, aging our market survey data. Other words for aging that you may see is advancing salary information or trending data. Here's the very simple formula for aging data. You take the number of months to age divided by the constant of 12 months multiplied by what we call the annual aging factor. The annual aging factor is the salary percent movement for this particular year. Now, in the United States, we're seeing salary budgets anywhere from about 3.8% to about 4.1%. So the annual aging factor is, in fact, the market movement. And you can get that information readily from many different sources, such as World at Work or SHRM, the Conference Board, and all the major consulting houses have this information. So we go through this calculation and we end up with the survey aging factor. We then need to multiply every salary rate within that particular survey by the survey aging factor, and then we can be assured that our market information is up to date. Let me give you some quick examples here. I'm giving you an aging factor of 4%. And again, that's the market movement. And that's based on, of course, salary increase trends. So let's say we have a salary survey with an effective salary date of January 1st. We need to bring that current to September 1st. The assumption is our planned year starts on September 1st. So let's go through that calculation. Look at number one. There are 8 months between January and September, divided by the constant of 12, multiplied by the market movement of 4%, gives us the survey aging factor of 2.7%. We then need to multiply every salary rate within that survey by 1.027 to bring our market information current to September 1st. The second example, I'm giving you a market movement of 5%. The salary effective date is March 1st for this particular survey. We have to bring it current to October 1st. And again, the assumption is our plan year starts on October 1st. Look at number 2. 7 months multiplied by the constant of 12, divided rather, then multiplied by that 5% market movement gives us the survey aging factor of 2.9%. So once again, every salary rate in that survey needs to be multiplied by 1.029 to bring current to October 1st. And of course, this lends itself nicely to an Excel spreadsheet. Other metrics. We are very concerned in our analysis in compensation of the middlemost part of our data. What is the most frequently occurring, let's say, salary rate or whatever it is you're analyzing? This gives us information on what is called measures of central tendency. There are 3 measures of central tendency: the mean, median, and mode. The mode is the most frequently occurring value within a data set. The mode is relatively weak. Not much you can do with the mode, but again, the most frequently occurring value in a data set. A real world example, let's say you wanted to determine the mode of the performance rating scores you give your employees. In other words, what is the most frequently occurring performance rating score? You calculate the mode. The median is the middlemost value in an ordered data set, where you have an equal number of occurrences above it and an equal number of occurrences below it. The mean, of course, is the average. We're all familiar with the average. You add up all your values and divide it by the count. So here is a nice compression of these 3 measures of central tendency and how we use them. Let's say we have these 5 employees. You see their annual pay, and we want to compute the mode, median, and mean. So we look at our data set and we find out there is no mode. In other words, every value in our data set is unique. Look at the median and the mean. And of course, I fashioned this just to make a point. The median and the mean are exactly the same value, which is 70,000. Whenever you have a distribution, whatever it is you're analyzing, where the mean and the median are the exact same value, you know automatically there is no mode, and also the distribution is completely flat. Now, I want to change this around a little. I want to take out Steve and I want to put Bill. Bill is the CEO making $930,000. Now, why you would ever do this in the real world is beyond me, but I'm just doing it to make a point. So with Bill added and Steve out, what are our 3 M's? There is still no mode. Every value is unique. The median remains the same. However, look at the mean. The mean jumps up dramatically. It is skewed all the way to 240,000. So the learning point here is the median generally is unaffected by extreme values within our data set because it gives us that middlemost value, equal number of occurrences above it, equal number of occurrences below it. And of course, the mean is affected by extreme values because when you compute the mean, every data point has equal power within that data set. Now, what's the real world application? The majority of companies around the world establish their pay policy at the median of the market because when you aggregate the analysis of all the salaries of your employees, you generally do not want outliers or extreme values to have a skewing effect on what your overarching pay policy is going to be. All right, let's get a little more challenging in our remaining minutes. Standard deviation. I find many analysts do not quantify the degree of dispersion or spread their data points are around the mean. Because whenever you analyze anything, salary surveys, whatever it may be, typically you're going to have outliers. The world does not operate on a straight line linear basis. What standard deviation does, it gives us a quantification of the degree of dispersion or spread our data points are around the mean. Standard deviation is just output from your Excel spreadsheets. It gives it to you already. Here's the definition. It is the square root of the average of the square deviations of all of the data points around the mean. Here are the formulas, and here's an important point. Standard deviation has two formulas. One if you're analyzing a population, and the other if you're analyzing a sample. So you have to determine in how you couch your problem. Are you analyzing everything or a subset of everything? Here's a useful point. Whenever you analyze anything outside of your company, it is always a sample because the world is big and the world is messy. Always a sample outside. When you analyze something inside your company is your own universe. You make the determination whether it's a population or sample. For instance, internally, I want to analyze the salaries of all of my engineers. That is a population standard deviation by the way you couched the problem. Oh, also, notice the difference in the formulas. The difference in the sample is n minus 1 in the denominator, and it is n in the population. N minus 1 mathematically is called a degree of freedom. Now, in looking at this formula, the sample standard deviation will always be larger than the population because we have an n minus 1 in the denominator of this sample. So in English, this degree of freedom is saying, well, we know we're only analyzing some of the data points, not all of them. So we kind of cast a wider net with our final result in standard deviation. Let me give you a very practical example. There's many of standard deviation. Here's a big one. Let's say in our company, we have, of course, as all companies, we have a policy of days absent, right? Regardless of what the policy is, we want to analyze our employees and how many days absent they took. And we have two operations, one in London and one in New York. So this is a sample of our employees in each of these cities. First, we determine the average days absent. And look at this, 13.92 for both cities. So if all we knew were measures of central tendency, we would say, well, there's really no difference in the days absent taken in these two cities since they have the same mean. However, we know better than that. So we go one step beyond and compute the standard deviation, in this case, the sample. So I did this for you already. You can practice this on Excel if you want. Look at London, 3.29. Look at New York, 1.16. Now, the fact that New York has a smaller standard deviation score, it means that the days absent are more compressed around the mean in New York. And look at London, 3.29, they are more dispersed. And if we were to plot the raw data, this is exactly what we would see. More compression in New York and more dispersion in London with the same mean. Now, here's the real world application. Let's say I have an employee in London that has 17 days absent. Would I be overly concerned with that? Probably not, because I have two additional employees with higher numbers of days absent. And of course, I'm leaving the policy aside for a moment. However, if I have an employee in New York with 17 days absence, flags would be waving. I would be very concerned because 17 days off in New York is definitely an outlier. And there we go. I want to introduce the 2 sigma rule for standard deviation, and I'll explain the importance of this in a minute. Any output in standard deviation, regardless of what the number is, it always represents one standard deviation away from the mean. That's why it's called a standard deviation. If I want to compute 2 standard deviations, I simply take the result and multiply it by 2. So London standard deviation was 3.29. Multiply it by 2, I get 6.58. I then subtract that from the mean and add it to the mean, and that gives me what's called the 2 sigma range. And here is a hard and fast rule. At least 75% of all of your data points will fall within 2 sigma. If you go back to the London data, you're going to find that 100% of the data points fall within 2 sigma. Did we violate the rule? No. The rule says at least. We use standard deviation to test for discrimination and for pay equity. And I'm running out of time for this example, but let's say we have one job called senior clerk. We have a bunch of males in it and a bunch of females. And we want to analyze, are we potentially discriminating against the women? First thing we compute is the average. Now I'm going to give this to you. The average female salary, you see it right here, is $1,775. The average male is $1,900. I also computed the standard deviation. Standard deviation for females is 18.20. I'm giving this to you. And for the male, it's 44.20. And you see that represented here. The female salaries are more compressed around the female average. The male salaries are more dispersed around the male average. I then did 2 sigma on both the females and the males because I want to capture at least 75% of the data. By the way, 2 sigma is accepted in courts of law all around the world. So here I'm seeing that there is blatant discrimination against the females. We have a lot of males making more money than a lot of females. The only place where we have just a handful of women making more than men is the crossover that you see in the male curve and the female curve. So here, corrective action definitely needs to take place. Also, there is something called a Z-score. This is an individualized standard deviation score. If I had a woman making 1900, which just so happens to be the average male salary, how far away is her pay from all of the other women? So 1900 minus the average female salary is 7075 over the standard deviation for the females of 18.2 gives us a whopping 6.87. So, this one woman who's just making the average male salary is almost seven deviations away from all the other women. This just confirms that discrimination is taking place. In the remaining minute, I'm going to breeze through linear regression. This is a very important topic. Here's the formula: y equals a plus bx. What linear regression does, it gives us a straight line that approximates the middle of our scatter plot. This is how we design pay structures, where we have our internal equity on the x-axis, job value, we have market pay on the y-axis, and we want to create the best compromise of how we internally view jobs and how the market pays those jobs. So here would be the resultant pay structure based on the linear regression analysis. Once you know linear regression, you can do a variety of analysis. Here I have my internal pay for my jobs. I have our point value that's established, our internal equity, and I also have market data. So here I can create two linear regression lines, regressing my internal value against my internal pay and my internal value against market pay. So here we see in the aggregate that we are paying below market from the low jobs to the high jobs. And this topic is what we dive in deep within our compensation metric certification program. I want to thank you all for your time and attention. Let me turn it over to Blake to see if you have any questions.
Any questions from anybody? If not, so far we had one question about whether this was HER CI certified. Excuse me. And it is not, but we will consider that in the future for these free webinars. We have these. We try to have these every week with John and many other people, and so keep us in mind for career learning for your education choices, and come visit and come take some of the classes with John. Like I said, we have cash compensation program certification coming up on April 28th. So I look forward to seeing you there, and you can get 20% off with code professional20. So thank you all. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everybody. And I really hope to see you and we dive deeper in our certification programs. Have a great rest of the day.